Sometimes I think the only thing predictable about Donald Trump is that he'll find a new way to shock us every day, sometimes multiple times a day. In the last week alone, he posted an AI-generated video of Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries saying,
"We're just a bunch of woke pieces of shit."
He pushed through the James Comey indictment. He told military leaders who were summoned to Quantico, Virginia, that they should use, quote, some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military. And despite the fact that the military is supposed to be apolitical, he urged them to applaud. By the way, they didn't. And, oh yes, we're in the middle of a government shutdown. It's exhausting and overwhelming, but as my next guest, Atlantic writer and host of the eponymous podcast, David Frum, has said, hopelessness is a resource of the tyrannical. I love talking to David about all of this and more, so we covered a lot because, let's face it, there's a lot to cover. David Frum, it's always great to see you. Gosh, so many stories, so little time. Where do we begin? I guess with the government shutdown. Before we talk about this particular shutdown, David, as somebody who's covered politics, gosh, probably as long as I have, if not longer, can you explain to folks listening why we are faced with this dilemma on a regular basis?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I don't know that I may have covered it longer, not with as much distinction, but thank you.
I would argue with that, but thank you for the sweet compliment.
So the Constitution of the United States says that every money bill must originate in the House of Representatives, must be voted by the House, then approved by the Senate. That's how the government of the United States gets money to pay for all the things the government does. And the theory is that Congress is supposed to every year pass a budget that gives the executive the money they need to pay for the military and fund pensions and pay for health care and all of that. Now, the practice has been this system broke down a long time ago. A lot of the federal budget is on autopilot. That Congress no longer votes about what the pension should be or what the health care should be. That just happens on autopilot. And there aren't regular budgets anymore either. Instead, there are a series of funding measures that the House votes and the Senate votes and the president signs. And they're passed with continuing resolutions, not with the formality that used to prevail, but in this kind of helter-skelter way. There's one other problem, which is unless this rule meets very, very strict conditions. There are strict conditions where you can pass it through the House with half the votes and the Senate with the majority of the votes. But oftentimes you need 60 votes to pass things through the Senate. Now, that's new. That also wasn't in the olden days. That's not in the 60-vote requirement is not in the Constitution, but it's something that is developed. So you have this failure machine, no regular budget, these stopgap resolutions, much of the government, the health care and the pensions ticking along anyway, and this need to pass things through the House with half the votes plus one, but the Senate with 60. And that creates these deadlocks. And as the parties have lost the habit of any kind of cooperation, we've had these increasing government shutdowns. They happened, just to take one more sentence, in the 70s and 80s, they would happen sometimes for like a day or half a day as kind of symbolic expressions of dispute. But in the 1990s, there was a government shutdown that went on for more, I think nearly a month or maybe even longer. And since then, they've flared up whenever the parties are, especially at loggerheads. And we've had a number of these shutdowns during Trump 1. I think that was the second longest. And now in Trump 2, we're going to have another, it looks like.
David, it sounds like such an effed up, antiquated system, right? Is it?
Boy,
there's got to be a better way to build. There's got to a better way to build a better mousetrap, right?
Well, one way would be to say that the budget of the United States gets passed by 50 votes plus one in the Senate, 50% plus one in the House, the way any other democracy would do it. And another thing that is really effed up is we have this crazy debt ceiling, which is the same problem only with nuclear weapons. And that happens in intervals where the Congress has a limit on how much the federal government can borrow. No other democracy does anything like this. And if Congress votes spending and votes a lot of spending, votes less taxes, creates a budget gap, and that budget gap accumulates, Congress has to have a third vote to say, okay, and we agree to borrow the difference. And if they don't do it, again, all kinds of bad things happen. But the government is shut down, and this may go on for a while.
What does it mean? I think people hear, a government shutdown, and they don't quite appreciate what that
Yeah.
entails.
Yeah. Well, it entails, again, Social Security payments continue to flow because they don't go through the regular budget process. And a lot of healthcare spending continues to flow because it doesn't go through the regular budget process. But everything that does go through the regular budget process, like the military, for example, many of those functions continue. The air traffic controllers continue, but the people who do the functions don't get paid. They get their pay at the end, but this can have a catastrophic effect for, imagine you're a young military family, maybe their children, and so maybe the mother is not in the workforce at that time. The family lives on its pay, and they're told, oh, you'll get the money 5 or 6 weeks from now. Hope you can negotiate a deal with the grocery store. I mean, what happens to them? It's beyond irresponsible, but it's become a bad habit of American government.
What else, though? I mean, other than those situations with military families or other people who rely on the federal government for,
Yeah.
To live, can you enumerate some of the other repercussions of this?
Well, the United States federal government is the biggest purchaser of goods and services in the entire world. It spends trillions of dollars. Much of that money goes directly into people's pockets, like Social Security, but a lot of it goes to people who provide services, like Medicare and Medicaid. The sick person doesn't get the money. The person who provided the health care to the hospital, and so a lot of those providers get hit by long delays. They have bills too. The hospital can do better getting a little bit of credit than the young military family that has to buy Pampers and groceries. But the hospital also has suppliers that need to be paid. So this reverberates all through the U.S. economy. And it raises all kinds of questions in the rest of the world about the stability and seriousness of the United States government.
Tell me how this government shutdown is perhaps different than ones that have come before it, in your view.
This one is here's one way that it's the same. Is the most famous government shutdown probably to this point was the one back in the 1990s between Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, and that was about the Republican desire to cut healthcare spending, especially Medicare and Medicaid, and Clinton saying no, and the Republicans tried to force Clinton's hands, and they ultimately failed. This one is also about healthcare spending. There are a lot of subsidies that go into the Affordable Care Act that Democrats want to make permanent. Republicans don't. And so the Democrats are withholding the measure passed, got through the House with Republican votes. The funding measure went to the Senate and got some Democratic votes, but not enough to get it up to 60. And what the argument is about is the forward argument is about should the Affordable Care Act be funded in full? But there's a back argument, because one of the things the Trump administration is claiming is that the president has the right to refuse to spend money that Congress has voted. Now, the courts have said that's illegal. The president doesn't have that money. Once Congress votes to spend the money and the president signs the spending bill, he's obligated to spend the money whether he likes it or not. That's what his signature on the funding measure means. I agree to spend the money that Congress has voted in the way that Congress said I should spend it. But Trump has claimed a right not to spend money, to withhold, in their technical terms, rescission, impoundment. But what that means, if you're a Democrat, you say, wait a minute, I'm going to strike a deal with you guys. And we want to spend a little more, you want to spend a little less. We're going to strike a deal on a certain funding level. And then the president says, okay, but I have a right after I sign the bill not to renege. I can renege at any time. And so one of the questions that Democrats are struggling with is, how do you do business with people who say they're not bound by the deals they strike?
How unusual is this? How unconventional is this kind of arrangement, given that Congress does have the power of the purse, right? And that Donald Trump, or the chief executive, the U.S., basically has to sign it into law, but it's sort of kind of a half-assed signature, basically.
Yeah. Well, he's an especially untrustworthy person, and that makes it hard to do these kinds of deals. Now, in a lot of states, governors have the power to impound funds or to do a line item veto. So the legislature votes, the governor says, no, I zero this out, I'm not doing this. So that's true in a lot of the states because the state constitutions permit it. And in the 1970s, President Nixon said that would be a useful power to have. It's not in the U.S. Constitution, but let me find out whether I've got it or not. The Constitution doesn't say I don't have it, so let me try. So President Nixon tried it, and there was a big crisis. He was this was during the Watergate period. He was unpopular. Congress objected. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, unlike many governors, the president does not have an impoundment power. Once the president signs the spending measure that comes from Congress, he's obliged to spend the money, whatever he personally thinks about the spending measure. If he doesn't like it, he can veto the spending measure and ask for another one.
So who looks bad in this scenario?
Well, that's going to be the real test of strength here. And one of the things I find interesting about this is the Republicans Republicans in Congress are a much more cohesive group. They hold together in a way that Democrats don't. And they're much more audacious. They're willing to try crazy things that a lot of Democrats are frightened to try. But the Democrats have that advantages too. So that's the Republican advantage. They're more cohesive. They're more audacious. Oh, one more advantage. They also were the first movers. That they set up, they said, this is the confrontation we want to have, because we're going to say the reason the Democrats want to spend all this extra money on healthcare is to give it to illegal aliens. And everyone thinks they don't like those. And you count on people. It's not true, but even if it were true, tell me, if the person coughing next to you in the subway has pneumonia, and you're worried about whether you're going to get that cough and that pneumonia, do you care about the citizenship status of that person? Or do you want that person to be treated so that you don't get pneumonia from them? That the viruses and bacteria don't care about the reason we would want illegal aliens to be treated is because we don't want to get sick from the illegal alien. It can be charity, but it's also self-preservation.
But you say it's not even true.
But it's not even true.
So why are we even hypothesizing about this?
Well, I want to take this one a little bit on because even on its face, even if it were true, say, okay, a school bus crashes and the kids are all hurt, and you bring the kids to the emergency room. Do you want to treat the kids, or do you want to check whether some of the kids are not in the country with legal status? There's a school vaccination program to make sure that the kids don't spread measles to each other. Do you want to check the status, or you say, if they're not legal, I'm happy to take measles from them. Fine, give me the measles. I need to make that point so firmly. But in any case, hospitals are not Medicaid, Medicare are not. Illegal aliens are not eligible for those. So the Republicans are gambling. They've chosen to fight. They've got the more cohesive group. They're bolder. But the Democrats have a bigger potential coalition behind them. More people are on the Democratic side of funding Medicare and Medicaid than on the Republican side. And the Democrats also have a more popular issue. So we're going to see. We're going to have a little test. And that's a little bit of what this is kind of a mock contest in advance of the 2026 elections. And the Republicans are going to see how much can we get away with, because their polls are looking bad, but this is a way to test, maybe our more cohesive group doesn't care so much about what the big numbers in the polls say, because those are kind of misty.
Your colleague at The Atlantic, Russell Berman, wrote, "In letting the government close and risking an even more aggressive assault by Trump on the federal workforce, Democrats have shown they're ready for a fight they avoided in the spring. What's less apparent, however, is whether they've started one they can win." That is the key question, isn't it, David?
Well, whenever you start a fight, you have to take on board the possibility that you can lose. And fights only happen when both people in the fight think they have a chance of winning. Because if one of them thought they wouldn't, then the fight would be backed away from. Trump is vowing to take action against the federal workforce. But, I think a lot of people don't understand what the federal workforce looks like. The federal workforce, when people think of the federal workforce, they may think about the way state governments work. State governments provide a lot of services to a lot of people. And so their workforces are quite big relative to their local economies. Their workforces are very female heavy. Their workforces are very people of color heavy, typically. The federal workforce isn't like that. Just think what it took in 1962 to mail a Social Security check, file clerks, all kinds of things. Now what does it take to send a Social Security check? It's like one person running millions of machines with vast computing power. So the federal government, where it employs people, it runs federal prisons. Where are those? Red states. Who works in federal prisons? Red state voters, typically. Federal government spends a lot on the military and military suppliers. Where are military services bought? typically in Sunbelt states. If people, not just the Navy personnel, but the suppliers to the Navy, the people who do the laundry, the company that pays the people, if they're not getting paid, that is felt in Florida and Texas and North and South Carolina. So the risks here are pretty complicated and hard to compute. And that's one of the reasons why this kind of behavior is usually unwise. But right now, the feelings between the parties are so strong, and the Republican moves are so bold that a confrontation was brewing for a while.
Once again, we find ourselves living in a parallel universe. According to this Fox headline, GOP accuses Dems of risking shutdown to restore illegal immigrant health care. Subtitle, Republicans accuse Democrats of prioritizing health care benefits for illegal immigrants over paying U.S. troops. Can we go back to the veracity of that claim, David? Because it's so much at the center of this whole debate, because you have both sides or each side saying different things. And I would love for you to clarify once and for all if this is happening and how the Republicans are getting away with perpetrating this falsehood.
Yeah. Well, at the center of this dispute are the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act that have extended Medicaid to more Americans and that support hospitals and others who provide services and also help people pay for their insurance premiums. So Republicans tried in the first Trump term to abolish the Affordable Care Act. They didn't have the votes even within their own party to do that. So they're now trying to starve the Affordable Care Act by turning off the flow of money. The problem is the Affordable Care Act is pretty popular. The people who get the Medicaid, who are newly eligible for Medicaid, because it's now available to a much wider population than it was before, they like it. The hospitals who get reimbursed for emergency care people who they didn't used to get reimbursed for, they like it. And the many, many people who are buying healthcare benefits for themselves in individual marketplaces who get a subsidy to do that, they like it. And Republicans still don't like it. And there's an argument, they have an argument to make. But they're afraid that their true argument, the one that actually motivates them, will not be acceptable.
Which is?
Healthcare. The Republicans basically, healthcare is a service like anything else, and if you can't afford it, you shouldn't have it. We don't subsidize people's Netflix subscriptions. If you can't afford a Netflix subscription, you don't get one. We don't subsidize your groceries. You need food to live, but if you can't afford a steak, you don't get one. And
healthcare is a privilege, not a right.
Well, they think it's a commodity in the marketplace, something you should buy. And there's certain classes of Americans, older Americans who get it no matter what, very poor Americans who get it no matter what. But if you're not very poor or old, that if you can't afford it, you don't get it. That's their view of this.
But where does the undocumented immigrant come in here?
Well, under the Affordable Care Act made very clear, illegal aliens cannot get direct subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. That's completely forbidden. They can't get them from Medicaid. They can't get them from Medicare. That's but the little bit of wiggle room truth is hospital emergency rooms are not allowed to turn away anybody by law. You show up, you've been in a car accident, you've been shot, you've been stabbed. The hospital has to take care of you. And I think most of us think, yeah, obviously. Sorry, Mr. Shooting victim.
Right. Let's see your green card.
Mr. Burn victim, a child in a school bus accident, person coming in with you've got the plague, and if we don't treat you, you're going to spread the plague to all your neighbors. People think, oh, yeah, the hospital should treat it. So the hospital says, well, how do we pay for that? And especially if you don't think of like a giant big city hospital, but lots of hospitals are smaller. They're in smaller towns. How do we pay? We did 13 hours of life-saving surgery. We had doctors, we had nurses, we had all kinds of equipment. How do we pay for that? And we look to the government, state or federal, to support our operating costs. And if the hospital isn't checking whether the person who receives the emergency service is illegal, then yeah, there is some flow of government funds. But that's the picture they're trying to conjure up is not that one. And
what is the picture they're trying to conjure? That we are just that illegal immigrants are flooding emergency rooms and costing taxpayers boatloads of money, and somehow if we deny this care, they are not going to come to this country?
Yes, I think that's the idea. What they're also trying to do is put together a bunch of words, and this is the way our minds work, that whatever your political point of view, there are words that you don't like. And if I can string them in a sentence, I can activate your emotions. And, let me give you one that more liberal-minded people may understand. So I just finished work on an article about this so-called bailout for Argentina, which I'm in favor of. And we don't have to talk about that today, why I'm in favor of it. It doesn't matter. The point is, when I think the typical non-Trump voter hears bailout for the central bank of Argentina, you're putting a lot of things they don't like into a sentence. And maybe they'll read my article in The Atlantic about why this is actually a good idea, and why it's not going to be as costly and it's not taking – but maybe they're busy. Maybe they have something else to do. And so the power of these words lands on the ear. All the things you don't like, bailout, central bank, Argentina, no. And Trump is trying to do the same thing, or J.D. Vance even more, with illegal aliens, healthcare, no.
In fact, I wanted to ask you, David, about this AI-generated video of Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. And Donald Trump posted it on X and probably on Truth Social, but I just watched it on X.
Yeah.
And it was so fascinating for me to read the comments and how people thought it was hilarious and so funny. And of course, many people on the other side of the aisle were completely outraged by this. And, it was just fascinating because basically the take on the Republican side or the MAGA side was, Democrats have no sense of humor, right?
Yeah.
And yet I couldn't get over that the president of the United States is posting something like this on social media that basically is undignified at best and really just vulgar and racist at worst.
There's something else that's going on, though, and that sort of gets to something that is deep about why the government is shut down right now. So just think about any negotiation you've ever been in. Price of a house, buying a car.
My contract.
Your contract. So there may be certain psychopaths who begin a negotiation by insulting the person on the other side of the table. But most of us understand that the beginning of a negotiation is a very good time to be polite. Because you're trying to get to yes, but you're trying to get the other person to say yes to something you want. And if you insult them, either you wreck the yes, or at least you make the yes more expensive probably than it otherwise would have been. So negotiations are usually conducted in an atmosphere of at least pretend respect, because otherwise things don't get done. But Donald Trump's vision of how he should work with the world is that he never negotiates as an equal with anybody. He's the king. He dispenses. And so one of the reasons we're going to this maybe for a while is he's going to have to yield something. To get to yes, he would have to yield something. And Trump's whole theory of whether he's talking to the Chinese, whether he's talking to Democrats in Congress, whoever he's talking to, he decrees what the result will be, and then they submit to his power. And he does these demonstrations, seemingly counterproductive, of obnoxiousness to make clear, I haven't given up on anything. But that makes it very hard to get to yes, because what may happen, look, it may happen that the Democratic position disintegrates in public opinion, they're under a lot of trouble, and they have to completely surrender. But it's also possible that the reverse happens, or something in between. And at some point, this will have to be closed. And at that point, all of this becomes more difficult and more expensive for the president. And maybe the president can't even be in the room because he's so offended the people he needs to get to yes.
When you saw that video, what did you think, David? And just like on a human level?
I think it's been a decade now since I had my first shock that somebody so crude and ridiculous and offensive could be an aspirant for president of the United States. I think those of us who came of political age before 2015, you had presidents you liked more, you had presidents you liked less, but there's a certain style and music that you expected of the presidency.
A certain threshold of behavior.
Yeah, you're exactly. And even the ones like Lyndon Johnson, who was so crude in private, I mean, just he would do the most disgusting things in private. But when he went out in public, he was the president and the role descended on him and he behaved in a certain way. It wasn't natural to him, but he did it. And then there were people who were more naturally gracious and proper, but even the ones who weren't, there was just an idea the president, this is not what a president does. Like the president doesn't ask people come to the Oval Office, did you stay in the hotel last night? Did you stay in the hotel I own? Yes or no? I need to know that I have $200 of yours in my pocket before we can discuss the arms sale to Turkey. Presidents didn't used to do that, and now they do. So I'm no longer shocked.
Well, now one does.
One does. One does. And one of the questions I ask is, do we ever go back? Is it going to seem kind of phony or artificial for a president to try to behave in a dignified and solemn way? Because if Trump had lost forever in 2020, then the lesson would have been, don't do this kind of behavior. But the American people do put up with it, and it did work. And in 2024, he won an actual popular vote mandate, which he didn't do in 2016.
So in other words, the floodgates have been open and potentially there's no shutting them in the future, which is really depressing to me. And maybe that's because I too, like you, observed presidents my entire life who had a certain amount of decorum and dignity and graciousness and all the words that honestly that I would want my children to aspire to. But it's just, as my father-in-law says, the sewer was always there. Donald Trump simply opened the lid.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, Gavin Newsom is now testing. Does this kind of style work on Democrats too? And Newsom's doing it in a kind of one-step, two-step way that he's saying, look, it's not me, Gavin Newsom, who's personally doing this. It's this artificial character. It's pretend Gavin, who I have created to troll and mock Republicans. But I, if I were president, would be a completely different person, I swear. But this pretend Gavin is the one who's doing much better as a politician than real Gavin was doing. And I think pretend Gavin is going to end up being in charge of whatever presidential campaign the real Gavin Newsom tries to run.
Well, it's interesting because I agree he's gotten much more pugnacious, but I still think there are certain lines that even the pretend Gavin isn't crossing, right?
Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, look, I mean, overt racism, he's probably not going to cross that line. But we're just into and maybe this is a consequence of social media. Maybe this is Donald Trump changing the United States.
Or maybe it's a combination of the two.
Maybe it's also, I think a lot of Americans are giving up on the idea that the United States should lead the world. That's, I think, one of the messages of those who support Donald Trump.
Really?
You know, for as long as any of us can remember, the job of president of the United States is more than just the leader of a country. There's something different in being president of the United States and prime minister of Denmark. President of the United States had this global role, these global responsibilities. Everything the president said. You know, when I worked for President W. Bush as a speechwriter, and one of the things that people said that was always weird about W. Bush was how he referred to terrorists as evildoers, which in English sounds a little theatrical. And so the question is, why did he hit that word? And it's because everything he said after 9/11, he had to weigh, how will this sound when it's translated into Arabic? How do I make sure that the word I'm using is translated into the Arabic word I want the translator to use and not an Arabic word? Because there are words for irregular fighter that in Arabic have a positive connotation. And there are words for irregular fighter that in Arabic have a negative connotation. And Bush was trying to drive the negative connotation choice. And so he used words that sounded often quite weird in English because he was thinking in more than one language at the same time. And a president has to think that way.
You think Donald Trump thinks that way?
Certainly not. No, certainly not. Just think of it. I mean, I'm originally from Canada. I spent a lot of time there. Canada has politics like everybody else. It has liberals and conservatives like everybody else. And in normal times, the conservative Canadians are more comfortable with Republican presidents and the liberal Canadians are more comfortable with Democratic presidents. So the systems are so intermixed and people know each other so well and they have family on both sides of the border. Donald Trump has created a situation where everyone in Canada is offended by him because he's spoken about Canada in ways that give offense to every single Canadian. I mean, all Canadians, liberal, conservative, socialist, radical, whatever their views, they all agree Canada should exist. Canada should be an independent country. And when the president says, okay, my starting point is Canada, there shouldn't be a Canada at all. And he said, look, I might agree with you on 8 issues out of 10, but when you're attacking my national existence, how do I agree with that? So but I think a lot of Americans say, we want to step back. We don't want to be responsible for the world. We don't want all these cares and concerns. Let China take over half the world and let Russia take over the other half, and we'll have Greenland and Venezuela, and that's enough for us. We're not going to be world leaders anymore. That's why we put up all these tariff walls.
What do you think is the danger in that?
So in the summer of 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt gave a speech to Americans who imagined that they could do this with the Axis powers. We could let the Axis take over the world, and we would have our little island of safety. And Roosevelt tried to explain to them in 1941, the world is too small and the United States is too big for Americans to be unaffected by what happens elsewhere. You can't draw a line around a country as big as the United States and say to the rest of the planet, what happens over there doesn't matter to us. Whether it's environmental, like hurricanes and climate change, whether it's epidemiology, plagues, diseases, epidemics, whether it's military threats, whether it's the movement of people. If you want to stop illegal immigration, it's going to be a lot better to have the countries of the Americas as your partners rather than as your enemies. If you want to stop the flow of drugs, you can't stop the flow of drugs by blowing up speedboats in the Caribbean. If you want to stop the flow of drugs, you have to work with the governments of those countries. And they will have asks because they also have politics. They'll say, yes, we'll help you. But this, you're asking us to do something that may be a little expensive here at home politically. There are people, we're going to be arresting people or doing things that they don't like. So there's something we need from you. The way the United States helped Colombia to break the power of drug cartels in Colombia was by helping Colombia to become the world's largest producer of cut flowers, all of which are flown into the United States. And it's had some impact on the American flower industry. But the United States said, well, to get Colombia to go on board with our anti-drug efforts, we're going to buy a lot more flowers from Colombia than we ever imagined we would or could. That's the kind of thing that if you are globally minded, you realize is other countries exist and they affect the United States and you can't hide from that.
And let's take it a step further, David. To give so much power to Russia and China has huge global implications.
Yeah. And China, and that power is felt in all kinds of ways that are not, people don't have reason to think about every day. So Argentina, to go back to the subject I'm writing about for The Atlantic this week, Argentina is in a terrible currency crisis this month as a result of some good things they did. They tried to do some very positive reforms, but they made some mistakes and they now have a currency crisis. And the Chinese are saying, you know what, Argentina, you're a huge producer of agricultural products. We will take all of those agricultural products. We will stiff the United States, take your products, and we want to integrate you into our currency block as the price. And I don't think there are many Americans who think much about Argentine grain production or the Argentine peso or the China-Argentina relationship until it goes wrong. When it goes wrong, then you'll notice it.
Talk a little bit more, though, for us about China and Russia, and if we basically abdicate, half of the world to those countries.
Yeah, it's not half. It's a lot more than half. Look, Americans over our lifetimes have built a world that looks more and more like the United States. It's got rules of law. It's got concepts of human rights. It's got democratic ideals, even if people don't always live up to the ideals. It's got a concept that war should be the last resort and that war has to be justified to to the community of nations. You've got the habit that you can speak English almost anywhere you go and use a Visa card almost anywhere you go. And if you have a dispute with a merchant in Thailand over the purchase on Visa card, that dispute will be adjudicated by Visa in ways that you're familiar with and that will make sense to you and that you've been warned about. And you as an American don't probably have to learn a second language except as a luxury. So the United States has built this world. If China and Russia are running the world, they'll make the world suit them. Here's one very dramatic example of this is so long as the United States is the most important economy in the world, the United States can say to others, you know what, in America, we don't pay bribes, or at least we didn't used to. And Now the president wants them. But before Trump, we didn't used to pay bribes. And because we have anti-bribery as such an important principle, we are going to enforce on American corporations that do business anywhere in the world an anti-bribery law. So even if they're in a place where there are bribes, we're going to say to the American corporation, you can't do that. And when the corporation says, but wait, that's unfair, because the French corporation will pay bribes, the United States says, we have enough power to put weight on the French not to pay bribes either. And what we're going to do is we're going to equalize the payroll, the playing field, but with the lowest level of bribery, not the highest. In China and Russia, they pay bribes all the time. And if they're writing the rules of the road, international bribery will be the normal way you do business everywhere on the planet. And Americans will just look like suckers and losers if they play by the same rules. So they won't be able to. So the United States companies will begin paying bribes abroad. And the more you pay bribes abroad, the more you develop the habit of paying bribes at home too.
And that's just one example. I mean, I think there are a myriad of examples of how treacherous it could be if Russia and China ruled the world.
Yeah. Since the Second World War, the United States always said, when people propose to carve up the world into pieces, this idea that Donald Trump likes, the American view is, sometimes you can't help it. There was an Iron Curtain and countries under communism. But the American idea has always been, look, we're not going to be impractical at this. We're not going to take crazy risks. But our idea, the thing we're going toward, if we can do it, is a world where it's all one world. It's all one world. We're not allowing some thug to rule a piece of it. We're going to have one world that tries to work by an increasingly common set of international norms and standards from everything from environmental protection to corporate corruption to human rights, and we're going to try to encourage and promote the idea that governments everywhere should rule with the consent of the governed. To the extent we can, we're not going to be gamblers. But we have a vision of the world. We're not going to allow others to carve it up and say, in our piece, we do torture people and it's fine.
What do you think has created this backlash against having the United States as sort of a world leader? Do you think it's anti-globalization? Do you think it's, pro-isolationism? I mean, what do you think is fueling this retreat for so many Americans?
Look, in some ways, it's the default setting for Americans. The country's so big, geographically and in population. It's separated by oceans from everybody except Canada and Mexico. So it's natural if you're an American to feel wrongly that the world is far away. And leaders have had to introduce Americans to the idea that what happens in the rest of the world matters. And Americans got a real lesson about that through the two world wars. We never want to fight a war like that. So the best way to fight a war is to prevent wars. And that means some American commitment to keeping the peace. And then the economy grew so strongly after the wars that Americans had the idea, we're all better off if we, buy and sell with Germany and Japan and France and Britain and Italy and Belgium. So I think two things have changed that. One is the China shock, where the United States is under enormous economic pressure from a huge country with a very sophisticated economy. And Americans say, well, maybe the best way to do that is to hide in the basement and lock the doors and turn on the taps, and we won't hear the Chinese economy. We can just make it go away. And the second is the shock of the Iraq and Afghanistan experience, where Americans fought these protracted wars that didn't feel successful, didn't feel worth it, and where Americans felt, why do we do that? And the next time anyone asks us to do anything, it's going to be like that all over again. And they're both Americans who feel that sincerely. Because
I think there are
their
reasons
loved ones
too, David. I mean, I think there are reasons for, if you look at sort of, you know this better than anyone, having worked with George W. Bush. If you look in hindsight about the rationale for some of those wars, at least Iraq, and, the whole fraud of weapons of mass destruction and the cherry picking of intel and the neocons and all that jazz. There's some legitimate regret by a lot of people for those wars, don't you think?
I think a lot of people feel that way. I think it's wrong, but I don't need to litigate that here. But what I'll say is that feeling is a resource. And that feeling can be used. So when Donald Trump wants to sell out Ukraine, that he invokes that feeling. As I say, I don't think it's a justified feeling, but it doesn't matter. Many people do. That is there as a resource. It's also there as a real thing. Like even if Donald Trump never existed, people would feel that way. Look, basically, the United States goes through these mood swings about the rest of the world. So after Vietnam, a lot of Americans said, that's it, we're giving up on the planet, and we want to retreat. Then after the Reagan years and the fall of the wall and the triumph over communism, and then the victory in 1990 in the first Gulf War, a lot of Americans said, you know what, maybe we do have something to offer, and maybe our leaders do know what they're doing. And so there was this emotional high, and then Afghanistan and Iraq lowered it. One of the things that's at stake in the Ukraine war is this is a hugely important global conflict fought for extremely good reasons, where the United States and its friends could win if they weren't being sabotaged by a president who's more sympathetic to Russia than to Ukraine. And I think one of the things that a lot of the people on the anti-American side abroad and the doubtful about America, the reason they want Ukraine to lose so badly is because they understand if Ukraine prevails, it calls into question a lot of the downbeat mood this country's been in. This recent phase in the Ukraine, not the most recent phase, but the backdrop to the war that started in 2022 was this moment in 2014 where Ukrainians went into the streets and drove out their corrupt pro-Russian government. And the flag they waved was the flag of united Europe. The blue banner with the gold stars. We want to be a part of that. And although a lot of Europeans are complaining about it and it's not very popular with the far right, we here on the streets of Kyiv, where we're living with these hard lives and we want access to what you have, and we think we have something to contribute, and we believe in these ideals that you seem to have forgotten. A lot of people look at this, those are dangerous people, because they're reminding us of things that people might think again if they're not discouraged and disheartened.
Before we go, and you've been so generous with your time, can I just ask you about a couple of other big news events, David, to get your take?
Sure.
Let me ask you about what happened in Quantico, Virginia yesterday.
Yeah.
With Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump gathering the top leaders of the military and basically, I don't know, giving them, depending on your perspective, a pep rally or a lecture. What were your thoughts?
Well, as with the big parade Donald Trump wanted, I think Trump and Hegseth don't take seriously that, the people in the military have jobs, very difficult jobs. And especially at the senior levels of the military, they're under enormous time pressure. So it's not, and they're not working just for the president and the secretary of defense. They work for the country. And if you're subtracting their time for something stupid, you're burdening them. You're also burdening the taxpayer because we don't pay their salaries for them to do stupid things. They were being there as props. I think the behavior of the generals and admirals was really admirable. They were polite. And I'm sure some of them support the president, but they all understood we are not political. We are not a prop for your rally. So when you tell us about your big victory, we sit on our hands. We do not clap because we are as a military, we had no opinion on any of those elections. Whoever is the legal commander in chief, we follow. We have, as individuals, our own opinions, of course, but as an institution, we don't. And so we will not applaud you when you ask us to applaud. And Trump, at one point, threatened them that if you don't applaud me, you're going to be fired. But there's safety in numbers. None of them applauded. Now, the danger is that Hegseth and Trump took the measure of what they saw there. And they also, in the first term, saw that the military didn't want to do illegal things. And they're thinking, how can we transform this officer corps to make the upper branches of the military as political as we want them to be?
As malleable, really, right, David?
Right. So now that's a process that starts, let's pick colonels who share our ideology and make them 1-stars. Let's find 1-stars who share our ideology and make them 2. You can't do it overnight. But I think that's going to be a big Hegseth goal. What we also saw, I think, was Hegseth trying to position himself as the biggest jerk in the Republican Party, remembering that in the last cycle, the biggest jerk in the Republican Party won the Republican nomination. And while Vice President Vance can often behave in kind of loudmouth ways, he's not by nature as big a jerk. And so I think we may be watching the beginning of an anti-Vance drive for the Republican nomination in 2028.
It was more than just a military event, though. I think that 44 minutes into his Quantico speech, Trump slipped in something pretty startling, stating, I told Pete we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military. That was a whole different ball of wax, was it not?
Yeah. That is something I've worried about a lot that they have in mind is deploying military units and testing it in 25 to see, can we use them to frighten away voters in the polls in 2026? And here's how this would work. So here in D.C., the National Guard comes as no shock. They're here every 4 years to protect presidential inaugurations. We have a lot of big demonstrations and other kinds of events. They come out to protect those and keep those orderly. So we're used to them, and we welcome them. But in this case, the Trump deployment has really depressed the city so much that you can see a decline in traffic to bars and restaurants, especially in the central area of the city where the Guard are being deployed. They're not being deployed where the crime is in the poor areas. They're being deployed near the official areas to make an impression. So if the kind of person who goes to a bar and restaurant in central D.C., they're pretty expensive. These are not illegal aliens. These are people educated people with legal status who are earning a good salary, but they want to keep out of the way. Now imagine what happens if you deploy the National Guard in Atlanta during election time, in Charlotte, in Phoenix. There are a lot of people who are themselves legal to vote, to be in the United States, but are maybe married to somebody or living with somebody who's not. There are a lot of people who are legal to be in this country, but maybe their parents aren't. And so those people, when they see this kind of force, they are afraid and they stay away the way the people who go to the bars and restaurants of D.C. have been staying away. And if they stay away, you can use the military to suppress turnout in elections in blue, and I think the real target are blue cities and red states. And given how tight American politics is, you don't need to scare a lot of people to make a big impact.
Do you think that's the goal?
I think they've been experimenting with that. And I think they're discovering the goal. I think a lot of Trump works by instinct. He doesn't have plan, goal, method, and arrange that, but he has a kind of instinct about what do I need to do to survive? And then he tests who do I bully and intimidate, and then he sees what works. And often his ideas don't work, but sometimes they do. And I think this is one that they're experimenting with to see, again, not in a kind of scientific mastermind way, but in a kind of crude survivor way. Let's see if this works. Let's see if that works.
James Comey, the indictment of Jim Comey. Thoughts?
Yeah. A lot of people begin their thoughts by saying, whatever you think of James Comey, and I say to everyone who says that, you need to hit the backspace key a few times. It doesn't matter what you think of James Comey. You shouldn't even introduce the thought. If James Comey was a genuine bank robber, really personally had robbed a bank, and the President of the United States gave orders to prosecute this particular bank robber ahead of that one, that would still be wrong, because the system does not work by the President telling the Attorney General who to prosecute. The President and the Attorney General, they lay down lines of policy, and then individual prosecutors who are chosen for non-political reasons use this awesome power of the state in an independent way. Once the President is telling people, I want this person prosecuted, but not that one. That one I like. Maybe he took money in a paper bag, but I like him, so he's scot-free. But this one I don't like, so go after him. You have lost what it means to be a free society. You've lost what it means to be a rule of law society. And it's really ominous. And there are more of these. We've seen some in the past with the prosecution of John Bolton, and there are more coming. And I think the target here, and Trump has said this in his first TV broadcast after the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, was he wants to use the power of the presidency to go after the donors to left-wing causes, by which he means to the Democratic Party. He wants to shut down He wants to use these methods to shut down the financing of his political opponents.
And the rhetoric he's using constantly, he's very good at, I think, creating these earworms like fake news. And now he's like radical left, radical left, radical left, the war within. These are very purposeful uses of language, are they not?
Yeah. Well, of course, there is such a thing as the radical left in any society, and it's a small number of very disaffected people. But Alex Soros, the billionaire in his Tribeca triplex, he's not a radical. He's just a standard liberal Democrat. And if he's your target, what you're saying is, I think the real crime, President Trump is saying, is giving money to the Democratic Party. Reid Hoffman, who's a big investor in Silicon Valley, liberal views. Obviously, he is in Silicon Valley investing in profit-making corporations every day, picking winners and losers in the market. He's not he's more pro-capitalist than Donald Trump with his protectionism and his special favors. But he's a person of liberal views, and he's giving money to the Democratic Party. And Trump named him as an example of somebody he would like to see targeted. So the goal here is not to Obviously, if someone throws a Molotov cocktail at a military recruiting station, that person should be prosecuted and if found guilty, punished. But what he's talking about are people who say, I think I'm for Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton, and that's the crime he wants them punished for.
Is this not insane?
It's wicked, but it's not insane.
I'm curious, just to bring the conversation full circle. You were talking about Richard Nixon and how the Supreme Court provided, gosh, what would the word be? A bulwark against his wanting to exercise so much executive power. But you tweeted this recently: the new Supreme Court doctrine, Trump's probably doing unconstitutional things, but these plaintiffs don't have the right to object, neither do these, nor those. But go ahead, keep trying if you haven't gotten the message yet. Oh, and not you either.
Yeah. So I was making fun of a particular decision they had where Trump had tried to hold back some money for foreign aid that Congress had voted that he should spend and that he had signed. So he had no right to withhold this money. And the people who had received the money took the case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, we won't hear the case because you don't have what is called standing, meaning this is a legal doctrine that not anybody can sue for anything. You have to have an interest in the matter before you're entitled to sue. So that's not a crazy thing. But this court has often used these technical methods as a way of avoiding saying no to Donald Trump. My late father had a joke. We used to travel a lot in Europe in the days of handwritten restaurant and cafe bills. My father, who grew up in the Depression, always scrutinized these with great care. And he had this funny line. He said, if these waiters were just bad at math, you would think half the mistakes would be in my favor. Okay. So when all the mistakes go one way, the problem is not that they're bad at math. When the Supreme Court is constantly found, we've got some little dodge here where we're not saying we're in favor of Trump. We're just saying that the person who's opposed to Trump can't have a hearing today, maybe tomorrow, but not today, and not you, and not you. That the court is using what is called its shadow docket. That is the things it's doing but doesn't admit it's doing in ways to help Trump. And that has been a real theme of the Supreme Court, especially since 2020.
So have you lost faith in the high court? I mean, do you feel like when you look at ways to contain these impulses and, not just impulses, actions that are anti-democratic, is the Supreme Court a lost cause?
Well, nothing's a lost cause. I studied law a long time ago, and one of the things that is good about studying law is it reminds you that judges are human and that courts are very imperfect instruments. But one of the things I've been saying consistently since 2015 is we use these phrases, institutions and norms, but they don't mean anything. It's just people. That's all there are, just people. People doing right things, people doing wrong things. And the people include each of us. And so the idea that I can sort of offshore my responsibilities as a citizen to someone who's going to look out for me, that's always an illusion. In more peaceful times than we have right now, more quiet times, the challenges are less, and so maybe you can pay less attention. But in these times, you have to pay a lot of attention because it's you. It's you. That's all there is. It all comes down to you.
In fact, I like your expression, hopelessness is a resource of the tyrannical.
Yeah, thank you. They want to make you feel like it's all lost. And so you see this a lot in certain circles where people say, well, because people want to look smart and worldly, like, well, you were naive ever to think anything would make a difference. But I believe everything makes a difference. There's just a lot of everything. And what we do matters. Not what I personally do will decide everything, but what I do does matter, and what you do does matter in the third person. And if enough people are motivated to do the right thing, it matters.
I want to ask you one question, a personal question, before I bid you adieu. And that is, a lot of people ask me about how I'm covering the Trump administration and bemoan this sort of more objective era of news coverage. And, I have wrestled with that a bit, but not really, because I feel compelled to speak out about some of these things and to not cover them as a passive observer. And I'm just curious if, as a result, does the media, and that's, of course, it's not a monolith, certainly more than ever. But does that contribute to a loss of faith in the media? I wrestle with this, and I'm just curious for your thoughts as someone like me, because I think you've known my work, and I've been sort
Yeah.
of on the public stage for, gosh, 4 decades now, about covering these stories and trying to help people, or covering these events and covering this administration and helping people understand. I don't want half the country just to say, I am a partisan.
Yeah. Well, you made your career at a company that was, when you were there, one of the, if not the very most powerful media corporation in the world, certainly one of the 3 or 4 most powerful media corporations, certainly because whoever's the most powerful media corporation in the United States is the most powerful in the world. That world is gone. And our understanding of media has to adapt. What is the most powerful and important media company in the United States? TikTok. And who's second? Maybe Facebook, maybe YouTube. The company, the fact that you were an institution was important in 1975 doesn't tell us much about how important it is in 2025. Second, I would say that media objectivity is not a matter of finding something nice and something bad to say about everybody, because some people have more good qualities than bad qualities, and other people have more bad qualities than good qualities. And look, if a hurricane strikes the Louisiana coast and shatters homes, there's somewhere in the world that is getting a little bit more rain than it otherwise might have. So there's a positive side even to a hurricane, but you don't have to balance your coverage of the hurricane by saying, well, yes, all these people have been driven from their homes and many are dead, but the flower gardens in Idaho are going to be much better next spring than they were last spring. You don't have to cover it that way. And the Trump people always want to say, well, wait a minute, because we were on the receiving end of legitimate bona fide prosecutions for genuine criminal activity, trying to sack the Capitol and murder the Speaker of the House and murder the Vice President of the United States. And that means that you can't complain when we do non-bona fide, personalized prosecution of people we don't like, because fair is fair. That's not how this works. I don't have to cover the bank robber the same way that I cover the person running the town soup kitchen. They're not the same. And so it's an injustice if I treat different things the same way. I do try to be aware of things that the administration has done right. I mean, the headline on the article I'm going to publish today or tomorrow is the Trump administration got this one right about something I think that they did right. And where they do right on things that are important, it's useful to say so. But we don't do our readers a service if we blind them to the way that things are different from the way they've been in the past, the way that Donald Trump's presidency is different from previous presidencies. And I think one of the lessons a lot of people, I will, thinking about George W. Bush, for whom I worked, I think a lot of people who said hard things about George W. Bush will look back and say, I don't recant those hard things. I genuinely disagreed with them and disliked that. But I may not have had the right perspective on how grave the situation was then as compared to how grave it could be. And so it's important to have a perspective. It's important not to overreact, but it's also important not to underreact.
David Frum, I really always get so much out of our conversations. Thank you for your time. And I know you got that piece to finish, so I'm going to let you go. Really enjoyed being with you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.